Perfect.
All right, everybody, what's going on? This is your tour guide around the SWAC Wells coming at you, and today we have a little special project that I've been working on. This was something that we have been talking about on SWAC Smoke a few times. Whether or not the offenses this season are just weren't that good, or is it just something that kind of was like a thing that you kind of remember last season better than this season, or was it just a figment of my imagination? So I wanted to go through and look at some of the numbers from last season and this season and compare and see. So we're going to talk about that. But before we do, you can hit those socials. Facebook is Swag Talk, Instagram, Swag Talk, Twitter, Swag Talk 76. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, comment, share. And if you would like to become a member, you get the join button. Otherwise, you can hit the super thanks, or you can donate to the Cash App, $ Swag Talk. Anything would be appreciated. So, like a school project, I had a hypothesis. My hypothesis was that SWAC offenses were worse than they were last season. They didn't pass the quote unquote eye test to me. So I wanted to kind of check that out. So I did. I did my research. I poured over the numbers from last season and this season, and I kind of mapped it up and figured out the difference between each stat between last season and this season, and I kind of came to a conclusion. And we're gonna talk about that, and I'm gonna look at it from a team by team standpoint, because overall, it's so many things that go into a season, so many variables. Continuing the school project thing, so many variables. New coaches, new players, injuries, position change, scheme change. There was also some rule changes this season, so I wanted to kind of see a difference in that. They changed the clock rules, which stopped the clock, didn't, which had the clock not stop at the first downs anymore. So some people felt like that would cut down on the number of plays in a game. So I wanted to kind of look at that as well. So we're gonna go through this. Like I said, I'm gonna kind of swoop over the 2022 numbers and 2023 numbers for each team, and then I'm gonna kind of look at the differences in the numbers, and then I'll kind of speak on what I feel like may have been a reason why that happened for each team. So we're gonna go ahead and start off with Alabama A&M. Last season, 2022 season, they averaged 25.6 points per game. They averaged over 412 yards of total offense. They were a pretty solid team offensively last season. They also averaged 183 yards on the ground per game, and they averaged 224 yards through the air with 11 touchdowns and 8 interceptions. Also, just to point out, I'm using only the conference numbers. I decided not to do the overall numbers because those games skew so wildly. You have some teams who play multiple FBS games. You have some teams who play multiple D2 games, so the numbers are not going to really be, they'll be skewed wildly. Like, for instance, last season, Southern played two sub D1 teams. They scored 123 points or whatever it is in those two games. Well, that skews their numbers a lot compared to the rest of the season. So, I decided to take all of that out just to kind of give you an even number, even set of numbers against even competition. So the Bulldogs, like I said, 224 through the air, 11 touchdowns, 8 interceptions. This season, they average 25.5 points per game, 366 yards per game, total offense, 139 on the ground per game. And they average 226 through the air with 11 touchdowns and 11 interceptions. So they average 0.1 point per game fewer this season. They had 374 less yards from last season to this season. They had a difference of 46.8 yards per game from last season. Those numbers were down 46 yards total per game, total offense this season. And they ran eight more plays this season. So in their case, they ran more plays even with the time rule change. On the ground, they ran for 392 less yards this season, 49 yard per game less from this season to last season. But they did have one more touchdown, and they ran the ball 22 fewer times this season. Through the air, they had 151 attempts and 271 completions to last year 149 out of 241. So they had two more completions this season, 30 more attempts. They threw the ball for 18 more yards, 18-15 to 17-97. They had a 2.3 yard difference on the positive rate, and the touchdowns were even from last season. They threw three more interceptions. So looking at Alabama A&M this season, they were more of a passing team. Last season, they were a heavy run team. They threw the ball, fairly well, but they were stronger with the running game, and a lot of it was because Donovan Eaglin had a really solid season last season. This season, he was battling injury throughout the season, and the running game just never really clicked to the level that it did last season in conference play. Now, they did have a really good game against Grambling on the ground, and that kind of helped those numbers. But for the most part, they ran the ball. They ran the ball less. Like I said, they ran the ball 22 times fewer than they did last season. So they threw the ball more and ran it less, and that obviously skewed some things. Now, they did throw three more interceptions, even though they threw the same amount of touchdowns. And a lot of this goes for them to playing two quarterbacks for various reasons, whether it was injury or just performance. They played Quincy Casey and Xavier Langford at quarterback. And like I said, the receiving core stepped up this season, and the running game wasn't as great as it was last season, primarily due to injury. So they kind of leaned on the passing game more. So you can see their numbers improved on the passing side. On the total side, they were down, and the running side they were down. So they were more of a passing team. So generally, like I said, that's a net negative when you look at the yardage and the points. But their passing attack was better this season. Looking at Bama State, last season they averaged 17 points per game. They averaged 296 yards per game total offense, 114 yards per game on the ground last season, 182 yards per game through the air last season with 8 touchdowns and 6 interceptions. This season they averaged 19.4 points per game. They averaged 298 total offense per game this season and 110 yards on the ground this season, and they averaged 188 yards through the air this season with 9 touchdowns and 5 interceptions. So they scored 2.4 points more this season. They had a plus 17 yard difference from last season to this season, and the 2.2 yard improvement from last season, 2.2 yard per game improvement from last season to this season, and they ran 25 fewer plays. So in that case, they did run fewer plays than last season. They had 34 less yards on the ground from last season to this season, and that led to 3.2 yard per game fewer from last season to this season, and they had one less touchdown than last year, and they ran the ball 35 times less this season. The passing game improved. They completed 16 more passes than they did last year. They attempted 10 more passes, and they had 51 more yards from last year to this year. Yeah, that's a 6.4 yard per game difference. They had one more touchdown and one less interception. So kind of like Bama A&M, the running game numbers were down, but the passing game numbers were up. And to me, a lot of the difference in Bama State's offense was they made a quarterback change, like the third or fourth game of the season. They juggled quarterbacks for a couple games, but toward the middle portion of the season, Damon Stewart took that job, and he's a better passer than Demetrius Davis, and you could see the numbers kind of increase through the air. And they still weren't great numbers because they didn't average 300 yards of offense, and they didn't average 20 points per game, but those numbers did increase from last season to this season. The running game took a step back, and that's partially because they didn't necessarily have a back that they could count on consistently, and they didn't have the guy who runs the ball at quarterback like Davis did. So there was a slight change there, but they kind of improved a bit. overall, their numbers went up overall. So that's definitely an improvement for them. Alcorn last season averaged 21.4 points per game. They averaged 350 yards a game total offense, 170 yards per game on the ground, and 180 yards through the air, with 6 touchdowns and 8 interceptions. This season, they averaged 25.6 points per game, 378 yards total offense per game, 127 on the ground per game, and 251 through the air per game. So automatically off rip, you can see Alcorn became a better passing team, and their running game dropped off. They scored 4.2 more points per game this season. They had 222 yards more of total offense from this season to last season. That's a 27.7 yard per game difference. And they ran 64 fewer plays. So they're a team who ran less plays overall than last season. So I think the clock rules kind of changed their numbers there. On the ground, they had a pretty big drop off on the ground. They had 346 less yards than last season, 43.3 less yard per game, and they ran for 6 fewer touchdowns. And they ran the ball 120 times fewer from this season to last season. So as you can see, their running attack kind of tailed off a bit, but the passing attack improved a lot. They completed 47 more passes. They attempted 56 more passes. They threw the ball for 568 more yards. That's a 71 yard per game difference. They had 9 more touchdowns from this season to last season, and they threw 2 fewer interceptions. And part of that number is the fact that Aaron Allen was healthy all season. Last season, he was injured at the end of the season, and they played a quarterback who wasn't ready to play. So they leaned on the run game a lot, and Jarvion Howard had like a 1,200-yard season last season. This season, the running game was kind of slow to get going, and especially in the early portions of conference play, Aaron Allen threw the ball for over 300 yards in a couple games. So the passing attack really blew up. Montario Hunt, Malik Rogers, Tavarius Griffin, those guys really ate on the passing attack for Alcorn, and the running attack was kind of not as great, but they still had some solid running games. But they were not necessarily a run first team as they were last year, as they threw the ball more than they ran it this season. Last season they ran the ball over 150 times more than they threw it. So they were definitely a team who shifted their philosophy through the season. Next team is Bethune-Cookman. The Wildcats last season averaged 27.5 points per game, 412 yards per game total offense, 139 yards per game on the ground, and 225 yards per game through the air with 13 touchdowns and 5 interceptions. This season, 277 yards per game, 146 yards per game on the ground, and 131 through the air per game, 7 touchdowns, 9 interceptions. They scored 8.6 points per game difference from this season to last season. They averaged 18.9 points this year. They averaged 135 yards less per game. They ran 4 fewer plays. They ran the ball a bit more this season. They had 53 more yards. They had 6.5 yards per game more, and they ran the ball 69 times more than last season. The passing game really dropped off. They completed 38 fewer passes. They attempted 33 fewer passes. They had 754 less yards, which is almost a 100-yard difference in total offense, 94.2. They had 6 fewer touchdowns, and they threw 4 more interceptions. And a lot of their problems offensively can be contributed to having a new coach and basically a whole new team. They played 3 or 4 quarterbacks this season. Never really had a consistency on the running game. Even though it improved a bit, it still didn't have the explosiveness that you would like to have. So they were kind of a team who just ran the ball, pick up 2 or 3 yards, pick up 2 or 3 yards, pick up 2 or 3 yards, punt. Not really being able to hit the big play down the field. And so even though they ran the ball 69 more times, they only picked up 53 more yards. So they did not really run the ball efficiently. They just ran it more. And a lot of it was due to them having a quarterback who had to run a lot because the O-line wasn't good. And the fact that they played multiple guys, they needed to lean on somebody. And the running game is usually what you lean on to kind of help your quarterbacks get acclimated, but it just never worked. So their problem could easily be attributed to coaching change, coming in late, and not having, the guys that you want to run your offense. FAMU, last season they averaged 26.8 points per game. They averaged 354 yards per game of total offense, 96 yards per game on the ground, and 258 through the air with 17 touchdowns and 8 interceptions. This season they averaged 31.7 points per game, 379 yards per game of offense, 156 yards per game on the ground, and 223 through the air, 15 touchdowns and 6 interceptions. They scored almost 5 points per game more. They had 581 more yards of offense. That's 25.1 yard per game increase. They actually ran more plays this year. They ran six plays more this season. They running game really improved from last season to this season. 635-yard difference from this year to last year. That's a 59.9 yard per game average. They had 9 more touchdowns and they ran about 35 more times. The passing game kind of dropped off a little bit. They completed 17 fewer passes. They attempted 29 fewer passes. They threw the ball for 54 less yards. They threw for 34.7 yard per game average decrease. They had 2 fewer touchdowns and 2 fewer interceptions. And their numbers are also an extra game because they played the SWAC championship game, so they played 9 conference games instead of 8. The running game was much improved this season with 3 backs that could tote the load. Musa didn't have his best season. I thought statistically last season was a better season for him. He was a bit more inconsistent this season, but they still had an explosive offense. They still were a team that could spread the ball around, and they could hurt you deep if they needed. They could hurt you in a variety of ways with the passing game. So even though the numbers were down, the threat was still there, and they still were a much improved offense because of their running game. So even though they had a drop off, the other phase of the offense improved a lot. So you can kind of see the trade off there. Grambling, they had 21.8 point per game average last season, 315 yard total offense per game, 169 on the ground per game, and 146 through the air, 7 touchdowns, 8 interceptions. This season, they averaged 27.1 points per game, 376 yards of offense per game, 168 yards per game on the ground, and 208 through the air, 10 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. They scored 5.3 points more per game this season. They had 487 more yards of offense. That's a 61 yard per game difference. And they ran 21 more plays. So they're another team who ran more plays than they did last season. This season they ran about for 5 fewer yards. That's a half a yard per game difference. They had 2 more touchdowns, and they ran the ball 1 more time from last season to this season. The passing game is where Grambling improved. They completed 47 more passes. They attempted 19 more. They threw for 492 more yards. They had a 61.5 yard per game average increase. They threw 3 more touchdowns and 1 less interception. And that's that's attributed to bringing in a better quarterback. Miles Crawley is a better quarterback than the guys they played last season. The offense catered more to what he could do. And the running game, even though the numbers weren't that different, the running game was still pretty consistent, and that helped them with the passing game. So a new quarterback made their offense go better, and a new offensive coordinator. You can throw that in there as well. So they made some changes on offense, and the offense improved a good bit. One of the teams who you are going to see a big drop off, and is primarily due to changes in changing the personnel philosophy and coaching staff, and that's Jackson State. Last season they averaged 39.1 points per game. They averaged 437 total offense per game, 148 on the ground, and 288 through the air with 31 touchdowns and 6 interceptions. This season, 25.3 points per game scored this season, 373 on the total offense, 162 on the ground, 210 through the air. They had 15 touchdowns and only 3 interceptions. They definitely took care of the ball when they threw it. They scored 13.8 points less this season. They had 952 less yards, 64.3 less yards per game, and they ran 91 fewer plays. They did run the ball for 41 less yards, but they averaged more points per game, more yards per game, 14 and a half on the ground. They had 1 less touchdown, and they ran the ball 5 fewer times. They threw the ball for 74 times fewer, 86 attempts fewer, 911 fewer yards, 77.8 yard per game difference. They had 16 fewer touchdowns, but they did throw 3 less interceptions. And all of that is can totally be attributed to change in coaching staff, changing personnel, changing philosophy. They obviously had new quarterbacks. They had a lot of new guys. They tried to lean more on the run game this season. And, when they did throw the ball, they didn't turn it over, but they didn't throw for a lot of yards. The running game got a lot better. They ran the ball pretty solidly. Valley is another team who had some changes. Their numbers last season: 16.1 points per game, 278 total offense, 139 yard per game on the ground, 132 through the air, 11 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. This season, 12.2 points per game, 259 total offense, 84 yards per game on the ground, and 174 through the air with 7 touchdowns and 8 interceptions. They scored 3.5 points fewer this season per game. Excuse me. They had 155 less yards of total offense, 19.4 yard per game less this season, and they ran 2 fewer plays. They had 488 fewer yards on the ground, 55.1 fewer yards from in the 2022 season. They did have 2 more touchdowns, and they ran the ball 11 times less. Passing the game, passing attack, their numbers went up in the passing attack. They threw the ball 30. They completed 33 more passes. They attempted 9 more. They threw for 333 more yards. They had a 44-yard increase in yard per game. They had 4 fewer touchdowns, and they threw 1 more interception. So Valley's problems can again be attributed to new coaching staff, a lot of new players. They played 3 quarterbacks. They did, kind of settle on a guy toward the middle of the season, but he was a young guy, so you saw some things, kind of work and kind of not work. The offense definitely, they lost a back like Caleb Johnson, which definitely decreases your rushing numbers. That's a guy who a couple years ago ran for 1,000 yards. So losing a guy like that in your offense is definitely going to skew your numbers the other way. Looking at the Panthers of Prairie View, they averaged 30.8 points per game last season, 400 yards of total offense per game, 239 yards of offense on the ground, and 145 through the air, 9 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. This season, 24.2 points per game, 360 total offense per game, 167 on the ground per game, and 192 through the air, 9 touchdowns and 10 interceptions. So they had a 6.6 point per game difference, a decrease from last season to this season. They did gain 35 more yards total offense. They had they had a negative 40 and a half yard average per game, and they ran 14 more plays from last season to this season. On the ground is where you see Prairie View's biggest drop off. Last season, this was a very, very, very strong rushing team. This season, they ran for 406 fewer yards. They ran for 71.6 yards per game less. They had 3 fewer touchdowns, and they ran the ball 23 fewer times. They threw the ball 14. They completed 14 more passes. They attempted 37 more passes. They gained 616 more yards through the air this season, and that's a 46.6 yard per game difference. Now they threw 3 fewer touchdowns, and they threw 4 more interceptions. So the numbers kind of give and take. Production in terms of points dropped off. They scored 6 fewer touchdowns this season than last season, but their running attack, going from over 230 yards per game to under 170 is a big difference. And they just never consistently ran the ball this season, whether that was due to injuries or just teams keying in on them, or they wanted to kind of pass the ball more as well. So those numbers kind of changed. The passing numbers went up a bit, but not enough to make a big difference. They did play 9 games, so their numbers are kind of stretched out a bit more because of that. Southern, they last season 25.1 points per game, 365 total offense per game, 180 on the ground per game, and 185 through the air last season with 12 touchdowns and 10 interceptions. This season, 23.3 points per game, 317 total offense per game, 125.3 yards per game, and 191 yards per game through the air with 9 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. That's a difference of 1.8 points per game. Um, 752 fewer yards on offense, 48.3 fewer yard per game, and 110 fewer plays. That's by far that's the biggest number of plays disparity from last season to this season of any team. Southern's offense definitely was not anywhere near where it was last season. They ran the ball for 621 fewer yards. They had a 55 yard per game difference, and they ran the ball 82 less times. They threw the ball 14 fewer. They completed 14 fewer passes. They attempted 28 fewer passes. They threw for 131 less yards. That they did have an increase in yards per game of 6.8, and they threw 3 fewer touchdowns and 3 fewer interceptions. The Southern numbers last season do have an extra conference game in them because they went to SWAC championship game, so that kind of changes their numbers this season. And Southern's offensive problems, you can say the offensive line, you can say new quarterback, you can say coaching didn't help them out that much. But that was Southern had the biggest drop off, I think, of any team on this list, even more than like a Bethune-Cookman or Pine Bluff. The Southern had huge drop off offensively in production, and you can see it if you watch Southern play. You can see that this offense was nowhere near where it was last year, even though they had a lot of the same skill guys. The offensive line was fairly new, and the quarterback was a guy who hadn't had a lot of experience, and it just never gelled for them. Texas Southern last season 24.1 points per game, 319 yards total offense per game, 174 yard per game average on the ground, and 145 through the air, 9 touchdowns and 4 interceptions. 283 total offense. 283. Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry. 28.3 point per game this season. 388 yards per game. 191 yard per game on the ground and 197 through the air. All right. Texas Southern, they had a 4.2 point per game increase from last season to this season. They threw the ball for they ran 4 more plays from last season to this season. 554 more yards and a 69.3 yard per game difference. On the ground, their running attack improved a bit, 139 yard per game difference. Excuse me, 139 yard total difference, 17.4 yard per game average difference, and they ran for 1 more touchdown. And they ran the ball 42 fewer times. They threw the ball 30 more times. They completed 30 more passes, 46 more attempts. They had 415 more yards through the air, and they had a 51.9 yard per game increase. They threw 4 more touchdowns, but they also threw 3 more interceptions. Now, looking at the numbers for TSU, they had a backup quarterback, Jace Wilson, play this season due to injury. So they kind of threw the ball more than they did last season, which to me, I feel like last season they didn't throw the ball as much as they probably should have. They ran it a lot last season and didn't throw as much this season. They kind of increased their passing numbers. They increased their attempts for sure, and they ran the ball less, but they were more productive because of Ladarius Owens having a 1,500 yard season. That made the numbers go up, even though the attempts were down. So they had a better offense than you would think. They scored the ball really well this season. So they were a very solid offense, even though they didn't have their main trigger man leading the offense. And finishing up this project is Pine Bluff. Last season they had a 19.2 point per game average. They had 273 yard per game total offense, 130.3 yard per game on the ground, and 143 yards per game through the air with only 2 touchdowns and 11 interceptions. You really can't go anywhere but up if you only throw 2 touchdowns. This season, they averaged 15.6 points per game. They had a 277 yard per game average, 129 on the ground, and 148 through the air with 8 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. 3.6 point per game difference for the Golden Lions, 29-yard difference in increase, and an increase of 4 yard per game. They ran three fewer plays. They had nine less yards on the ground. That's a 1 yard per game difference, and they ran the ball 23 more times. They completed eight less passes. They attempted 26 fewer passes, but they threw for 40 more yards, and that's a 5 yard increase. They did have six more touchdowns and four fewer interceptions. Um, this is done now. When you look at this team, compared to some of the other teams who had new coaches, new quarterbacks, and new systems and everything, um, their numbers aren't that big of a difference from last season to this season, and they played multiple quarterbacks as well. I think the fact that their guys that they played pretty much were quarterbacks who played last season, so I think that may have had some difference in it. Um, they ran the ball more because they tried to be more of a running team, but they had running back injuries. Um, and to say this was a team who were behind a lot, they didn't throw the ball as much. So Pine Bluff is kind of an odd duck in this situation. I think when you look at the numbers, you don't really see a big difference one way or the other. And that's weird because, like I said, this was a team that only won one conference game, and that was their last game. They lost every other game by double digits, so they never really were in a lot of games, but they still didn't throw the ball a lot. And they had a lot of injuries in the running back room. They played multiple quarterbacks. You would think that the numbers would be a bit skewed toward last season and this season instead of being basically even. So kind of just looking through this, um, I can't say that these offenses were necessarily bad. I will say I think this season most people's numbers were down. Um, there were some teams who got better offensively this season. For instance, like a FAMU, even though they were a good offense last season, they were much better this season. Gramblin's offense improved. Alcorn improved. It was a slight improvement, but Bama State improved. Um, a team like A&M, they kind of in the middle. Um, Jackson State had a drop off, but that was to be expected, losing as many guys as they lost and coaching staff and everything. And Prairie View took a step back as well. The biggest change that of a team that didn't have a new coaching staff would be Southern. Their offense just dropped off the cliff this season. But they still, they hit a lot of explosive plays, and that's why even though their numbers aren't great, they're better than they probably should have been because they did hit a lot of explosive plays, especially through the air. Just no consistency. Valley and Bethune-Cookman took steps back. That's to be expected. So I guess to answer my question, SWAC offenses weren't bad. They weren't good, but they weren't bad. They were probably I would say they were average um, at best. And most teams had a reason why their offense took a step back this season. So like I said, looking back at it, I guess I could say when you look at the production from last season to this season, yes, some of the numbers are down. This season, there's a lot less scoring. In some cases, I think the total offense numbers were a bigger difference this season to last season. Um, Most teams didn't run the ball as well between this season and last season either. So to me, that's the biggest difference. There were some slight changes. Um, there were some slight changes between the teams. But other than that, there weren't a lot. Like if you look at last season, just for instance, looking at the total offense numbers from last season to this season, um, you basically had as I fight with my charts and stuff, you basically had one, I believe. Why is it doing this? Of course, it don't want to do what you wanted to do. Uh, Moral of the story, man: do this stuff before you get started. Um, this season, last season they had two offenses with over 400 yards per game of offense. Um, Everybody else was over 300 yards. They had three teams with under 300 yards of offense this past season in 2022. Um, that's that's I think that's what kind of makes it look like it wasn't as good because more teams didn't gain as many yards this season. There were no offenses over 400 yards per game. They had four offenses under 300 yards per game. So not a big difference, but when you look at teams averaging over 400 yards, and that's not a common group, but to have two last season and none this season, it is definitely a big difference. The leader this season was 388 yards per game. That would be third place last season. So not that's not a big difference, but it just looks that way. I think when you look at the games on the field and you look at the numbers, things kind of look a little bit different. But that's kind of how these things go. Um, Most teams, still aren't really great passing offenses. Last season we had four offenses with over 200 yards per game. This season we had five. So it's kind of a give or take thing. And I think that's where the difference is. This season, 15 touchdowns were the most through the air, and obviously Jackson State threw 31, so that's an outlier. FAMU threw 17. So it's kind of like it's kind of a difference here and there, but it wasn't that big of a difference as I thought. So just being able to go back and look at this and kind of get an idea of what's what. I can say that the eye test, quote unquote, wasn't great, but when you crunch numbers, and numbers obviously aren't the end all be all, but when you crunch numbers, it wasn't that big of a difference. So I was able to kind of prove myself wrong. I don't think the offenses were bad. I think there were some good offenses. I think some weren't that good, and most of them were average. But they all had reasons for being the way that they were. So that's gonna do it for today's show. We have our HBCU top 10 coming at you tomorrow, and also gonna talk a little SWAC basketball on that show as well. So with that being said, man, I'm your tour guide, C. Well, signing out, and I'm gonna catch y'all on the rebound. Peace.